Welcome, everyone. All right. I think let's start. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the National Book Critics Circle event, a conversation on poetry criticism. I'm Rebecca Hussey, here in my role as the NBCC tech person. And I'm your tech host for the evening. So I just want to make a couple announcements as we get going. First, I want to welcome Mylin Hill as our ASL interpreter for this evening. So thank you so much for joining us, Mylin. And if you want to enable closed captioning and view a live transcript, click Show Captions button at the bottom of your screen. You can click View Full Transcript to view the transcript in the side panel of the meeting. So we're recording the meeting to make it available for people who couldn't make it tonight. Please use the Q&A function to ask panelists any questions that you have. And they welcome questions, so please ask. You'll see the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So you can just enter your questions right there. And we'll do our best to monitor questions and answer as many as we can. So the NBCC is grateful to all our members who could join us tonight. So welcome, members. We love you. If you are not a member of the NBCC, we'd love to have you join us. You can find out about membership at our website, bookcritics.org. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to our president, Adam Dalva. Take it away.
Hey, thank you so much for that. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I'm the president of the NBCC. This is my brief cameo tonight before we turn it over to these brilliant critics and poets. The NBCC is comprised of 800 plus members, including our panelists and moderators tonight, who make events like this possible. Like I said, we'd love it if you join us anytime. We could really use your help. And thank you again to Mylin for the interpretation. I'm going to first introduce our panelists and then our moderators. David Orr is having technical issues with his hotel Wi-Fi, but we're hopeful that he joins us down the line. I will just give him a brief introduction in a second, just in case. First, Stephanie Burt is Donald and Catherine Locher Professor of English at Harvard. Her many books of poetry and lit criticism include most recently Super Gay Poems from Harvard University Press and We Are Mermaids from Grey Wolf. Ask her about the X-Men if you dare. And I have to add that Stephanie was the chair of our poetry committee my first year on the board, which was a sensational experience. I've never forgotten it.
I'll come back and do it again someday if you're not careful.
My God, I would love it.
I
I'm
mean,
just introducing people. Don't tempt me like this. Okay, next, Anahid in New York City. Here's David Orr. Anahid is author of 3 books, Keats' Odes, A Lover's Discourse, The Calamity Form on Poetry and Social Life, and Utopia Limited, Romanticism and Adjustment, and is currently writing a book called How to Have Sex in a Poem under contract with FSG. The former poetry editor of Granta magazine, she's also a frequent contributor to the NYRB. Her work has appeared in the New Yorker, the LRB, the New Left Review, N+1, the LARB, the Paris Review, Badoon, Poetry Magazine, Moose, and elsewhere. She lives in Los Angeles, where she's a professor at the Department of English at UCLA. And last, and we're so glad you made it, David Orr is a professor of poetry and the practice of criticism at Rutgers, where he is my colleague. We teach at the same time sometimes, and I hear a lot of laughter across the hall, hopefully positive. Uh, he's also a longtime poetry. He was a longtime critic for the New York Times Book Review, among other publications. He won our Nona Balakian Prize for criticism. His first book, Beautiful and Pointless, A Guide to Modern Poetry, was named one of the 20 best books of 2011 by the Chicago Tribune. His subsequent books have been covered in outlets ranging from the Wall Street Journal to NPR to PBS NewsHour. He's also the winner of the Editor's Prize for reviewing from Poetry Magazine. Last but not least, our moderators are 2 current board members of the NBCC who I'll just introduce in 4 lines each. Rebecca Morgan Frank is the author of 4 books of poetry, OU Robot Sings, one of the New York Public Library's best books of 21, Sometimes We're All Living in a Foreign Country, The Spokes of Venus, and Little Murders Everywhere, shortlisted for the Kate Tufts Discovery Award. She currently writes a poetry column for LitHub, Run Don't Walk, it's fantastic, and is an assistant professor at Lewis University. She's also a previous chair of our poetry committee. And David Wu, who's the author of Divine Fire and The Eclipses, which was the winner of the A. Poulin Jr. Poetry Prize. His poetry has appeared in a list of outlets that was so long I just said it everywhere. And David is the recipient of a Wallace Stegner Fellowship and the current chair of our poetry committee. That's it for me. Enjoy, everybody.
Great. Thank you, Adam, and thank you, our distinguished panelists. I've been reading through your oeuvre and have been so delighted to remind myself of your eloquence and brilliance and all of that. I thought I'd start out with a general question to all three of you, and then Morgan and I will switch off asking questions that are both general and specific. The first question is sort of a general one. I want to get a sense of the interiority of becoming or being a poetry critic. Since we live in such contested times when it comes to what constitutes aesthetic taste, the first question I wanted to ask was basically what kind of criteria do you find especially useful to consider as you review a poetry book? Stephanie mentions that the poems most worth attention, more worth rereading, stand apart for how they sound. Anahid says that the most heretical attitudes towards form often give the strongest evidence of what it can do. In Tuesday's review in the Times, David praises John Cady's wry, melancholy charm, in which style is aligned with substance. For the critics who are watching now, what principles are foremost in your mind as you formulate an opinion about a book? Perhaps we can start with Stephanie. You're mute.
Are we better now?
Yes.
I want to be sure I'm getting the question right. Is it what stands out first when I'm reading a new book, or is it what stands out as a goal when I'm reviewing a book? Because those are kind of different questions.
Yes. I'm talking about reviewing a book that you've just received and are starting to read. You're starting to formulate your vision or understanding of the book as you're reading with the goal of ultimately writing about it.
So I am going to quote my favorite 20th century bisexual disaster, William Empson, Empson, if you're following along at home, who said, "You must rely on each individual poem to tell you the way in which it is trying to be good." And when I am trying to figure out if I like a book enough to ask to review it, or enough to accept an offer to review it, I am trying to figure out what the poem is trying to do. Uh, a Bernadette Mayer book is going to be trying to do something that is quite different from an English Shang book, which is going to be trying to do something quite different from, let's say, a Kay Ryan book. Um, those are poets whose work has a great deal of unity and who are moderately famous somewhere, and that's why I chose them, and they're recent. Uh, so I don't know that there are first principles other than this needs to be interesting, and I need to be interested in the way that it sounds and the way that it uses language, not just in the arguments that it makes. If I'm bored, I will just give up. If I'm interested, I'll keep reading until I have some sense of why it does what it does. And if I'm still interested enough to reread it a couple times, I will probably attempt to review it or accept an offer to review it. And at that point, there's a real 90-degree turn because I start to think about who I am writing for. Because if I am writing about a Canadian poet for Canadian literature, I don't need to tell them about Canada. If I'm writing about it for the New York Times Book Review, I kind of do. If I'm writing about someone if I've got 2,000 words, I can really go into detail about the metrics. If I've got 300 words, which is a challenge that David Orr is familiar with, you can't say more than about 25 words about the metrics because you need to, explain what a villanelle is or where Albuquerque is because it's the New York Times Book Review and you can't assume people know things and your reviews have to fit in a tiny, tiny box between the advertisements. So there's a lot of who am I writing for? What do they already know? What do they expect to take away? Once I've gone from do I like this to who am I talking to about it?
Thank you. That's a wonderful answer. David or Anahid, do you have additional thoughts to add about that? Uh, David?
Oh gosh, is my mic working? That's my
Yes.
Yes,
first question.
it
Oh, it
is.
is. Oh, fantastic. I've been all over this hotel trying to find some place I could manage to do a Zoom call. This is so exciting for me.
Where are you, David? That looks like a nice hotel.
It is. It's a really nice hotel. I'm in Switzerland, of all places. My wife had a conference in Fribourg, and so we're here on a vacation. And this is a very nice hotel. People are really friendly. They just don't have much of a wireless signal. So finally, I've located the one spot that I can do this call at. Anyway, I actually thought Stephanie's answer was terrific. I don't have too
Yeah.
much to add to it. I maybe wanted to highlight a couple of things actually. One thing that gets left out a lot is sound, and I'm really charmed. I see you nodding. I know we feel the same way about this. I, if somebody sounds good, I really can't resist them no matter what else they're doing, and I mean none of us can. And for me, I often find that if the book sounds good, I will be either or both uh, envious of it and slightly irritated by it. And so then I let it sit for a couple days. And if I can't get rid of those feelings, I realize it's pretty good. I should probably write about it if I can. But further to Stephanie's point about the issues, the limitations of audience and just word count. I mean, let me be specific about this since you mentioned that review of John Cady. I mean, try to review John Cady in 800 words is ridiculous anyway. It's almost impossible to do. The guy's he's 80 years old. He's got lots of books. They're really long. They're deep in some sense. It's hard. You can't do it. And then you're constrained by things like, for instance, I quote one of the poems, and his line is something like he's being funny and he's saying something about how you know some notion of something, the philosophers have talked about it, but no one gives a shit because they're philosophers. And that's what he writes. No one gives a shit. Well, the Times won't let you say shit. So if you read that review, you will note that the line stops where shit is. It says something like, and you can't really do that. And then goes back into the quote. And it's just, what am I supposed to do with that? I don't know how much that adds to the conversation, but I just wanted to throw it.
Anahid, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I too agree completely with Stephanie and William Empson as always, and I second everything that's been said about sound. I think about that line from George Michael, "Got to have some faith in the sound. It's the one good thing that I've got," right? I mean, I agree with that too, and I think that, people often mistake poetry for being about the content of language as opposed to the sound of language, and so it's where I start too. I think for me, I have a kind of funny relationship to reviewing poetry in that I think I have only ever been commissioned to write reviews of poetry, and I only ever find myself pitching reviews of other kinds of literature. So I partly do that because I think that my own personal tastes in poetry run obscure enough that the books that I would be most interested in are unlikely to be reviewed in the venues in which I typically write. So I like to be told what to do. And so often what happens is it's not necessarily for me a question of, well, what is it that I could possibly say about this book? It's more, what can I say about this book that would not automatically have interested me anyway? Because a lot of the things that I get assigned to review don't necessarily automatically interest me anyway, although then I can find them to be incredible. So, I think about Anneliese Gelman's book, Vexations, which was assigned to me by the NYRB and that I think is extraordinary and one of the best books of poetry of the 21st century. I mean, I think it really is incredible. And that was a book when I started reading it, I thought, before I even thought, what would I say about this book or do I like it? I was just completely floored by its eccentricity and its total lack of resemblance to anything that I had read recently. So that's an exciting feeling. I mean, I think for me as a writer, the best place to start from is I have no idea what the hell is going on. That's a really great place for me to begin from. But if it's something, to not necessarily tell tales out of school, but if it's something that I know that I have to review, I don't necessarily like it, then the question becomes somewhat more complicated, which is what are the criteria for not liking something, which I think you have to defend a bit more assiduously than you have to defend the criteria for liking something, because you want to be fair always. And so that often presents more of a challenge for me, but an exciting one.
That kind of segues into, I'm going to jump to a different question that I was going to, because I was going to ask you all to talk about liking. So, I mean, those of us who teach in the academic classroom are always like, don't say you like it, evaluative language in a workshop. But I was thinking how each of you, Steph, in an interview said, it's risky to say I really like this and it speaks to me. And that's the kind of risk that I want to help people take. And of course, Anna, do you have that moment in the Calamity Forum where you start like saying like, words where say, but you defend that later saying, in general, I speak for myself, right? This is, and then David, I have to pull up for you, and you too could write a poem. There were a couple of things, but I don't like poetry. I do like very much certain poems and poets, right? So even though we say, oh, what is the role of liking? It does have a role. And I just wondered if you all could elaborate on that, on the role of liking and maybe the permissions and problems that brings.
Oh no. Is this, do I
Are
have
you
to start
batting first
again?
against Stephanie?
Do I have to?
I think you've started.
Oh no. So why would you be in this line of work if you didn't want to explain why you liked something? I mean, there are many fields of life where we really need to spend a lot of time understanding and figuring out the inner workings of things that bore us because we have to save lives or feed people or get from place to place. There are a lot of people who have to learn how to drive who don't really care. But very few people in our culture have to learn how to read poems or how to read particular poems. And unless you are doing very specific kinds of historical research, why would you do this if you didn't like what you were doing? Now, the critics who frustrate me, the critics who I don't want to be like, pretend that they like all the poems that they like, or maybe they do like all the poems they like for the same damn reason. They say things like poetry always brings you closer to your essential self, or poetry puts you in touch with the unknown. And they seem to look for the same damn thing, which is like only ever eating ice cream for dessert or only ever eating dessert. Uh, I would like to describe and communicate and find out why something moves me and gives me pleasure and interact with me in my sort of non-professional, the rest of my life context in order to make it available for others. And my favorite sort of general, this is why we do what we do person who is extremely theoretically sophisticated, who is not a poetry critic, who has recently defended liking things and remembering that people read literature for an emotional response and why would we be in this if we didn't like things? Is a critic named Rita Felski, Felski, who every 2 or 3 years writes another book explaining that literature, unlike plumbing or heart surgery or I don't know, vaccine research exists because people actually want to produce and talk about it and reread it. And if you want the real theoretical armature beside, behind, we're kind of here for liking things. We're here to explain why we like the things that we like and help other people like them. I really do recommend Rita Felsky's books, which tend to have novels and films as their leading examples, because for some reason she prefers novels and films to poems, chamber music, and pop songs and comic books. I don't know why she has the preference, but you know, if you liked all the things that I like and only the things that I like, you'd be me, and nobody wants that. Um, Morgan,
Mhm.
and he, David, double David.
I think I went second last time. I'm going to put the pressure on Anahid to now.
I know I wasn't sure if we should keep the same order, if I should jump in. I once had my friend Maureen McLean, who's a wonderful poet and a wonderful critic, once said to me after reading a review of a book of poems that I had written, I'd written the review. She said, I couldn't tell if you liked it or not. And my response, I'm pretty sure my response was, I kind of don't like anything and I kind of like everything. And what I meant by that, it was flip, but I think what I meant by that is that for me, my sort of hat as a critic and my orientation as a critic is a bit different from my hat and orientation as a reader. So I think that, as a reader, I love to take something that I've loved and press it into somebody's hands and say, this is why you should read this book because it's really great. Whereas being a critic for me is a little bit more like being a mechanic. And I don't know anything about cars or any kinds of machines, but I can imagine that this is what talk about how something works. And I think that that's a valuable pursuit. And partly what I think I'm modeling for a reader is a certain way to use your brain that we don't often get to use our brains in this particular way. So for me, I think it's a little bit less about liking or not liking first than it is how is this thing put together? Let's take it apart. Let's put it back together. Let's see what's come of that. And so I often begin, I think, and proceed through that perspective. But I tell my students all the time when they say, oh, they didn't like something, they don't like it. I always say that that's an excellent jumping off point for really having fun with an object, whether it's a poem or a film or, a novel or whatever. I think that not liking something is a wonderful instinct. And I think it tells us a lot about what's actually happening. I think for a lot of undergraduates in particular, and also sometimes for graduate students, and also just for people, for anybody, the experience of not liking is one of either feeling repulsed by an object or rejected by an object. It doesn't want, this poem doesn't want you, this poem has nothing for you, it's not interested in you as a reader, or you're just turned off by it. But in fact, I think that that feeling of alienation from a literary text, let's say, can be a really fabulous way into the text. And so I try, I think, in my own writing to move. You quoted the line from The Calamity Form, the opening of the chapter on Wordsworth, which is that I don't like Wordsworth. I actually try to use that as an inroad into talking about something in a way that hopefully is interesting and generative.
I have so much I want to say in direct response to that, but I want to hear from some Davids first.
Oh, go ahead. I'll weigh in if you have a direct response. Shoot.
Yeah. So there's a difference between okay, first, Annie, is it possible for you to really like something without wanting to figure out how it works? Because those are the same thing for me, especially with poetry.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
so if wanting, I think like car people are like this with their cars. Like if you're really into how something works, if you're really into something, you want to climb inside it and move around in it. You want to be able to figure out why it's so awesome and then maybe explain that to yourself, which means explaining it to others. So I don't experience those things as separate. I guess the other like giant question mark goes off above my head as you describe your process, which I love hearing about. I love reading your work so much and look forward to just spending time with the bits they haven't spent time with yet. There's a difference between feeling rejected by something and feeling like it's kind of mid.
Hmm.
There's a lot of books. I mean, we must all have this. You know, I don't know how many books you get in the mail, but how many books of poetry you get in the mail every week. It's got to be like at least a few dozen, right?
Hmm.
And most of them are not that interesting, and I don't like them because they're boring. And if I tried to learn about myself by asking why most of them seem kind of mid or meh or boring, I would not ever eat dinner because it's been too much time asking why something was boring. The feeling, on the other hand, that a poem is actively rejecting you or trying to kill you, and I'm actually, that's not hyperbolic. When I read Robert Frost's Directive, which is
Hmm.
one of the great poems in the language and which I love teaching and have written about, I do feel that Robert Frost is trying to kill me. And one of Amiri Baraka's most famous poems is literally recommends killing me. So that's all the people in the category to which I belong. That's interesting. That's a teachable moment, and that's worth scrutinizing. I really do feel like Robert Frost's poem Directive is trying to kill me. And that's fascinating, and that is a great poem. But that is different from just saying that something is. Um, and that is a relatively rare feeling. And now that I've attempted to turn this into a discussion of Frost, I think we need to give the microphone to David, but not before praising Maureen McLean, who is really a model for so many things, I think, for several of us. Hi, Maureen, if you're out there.
Hi, Maureen.
I feel like she has to be, right? If she's not, missing out.
She
I mean,
doesn't
I think she's
have to
great too.
be.
I've known her for a million years.
Yeah. So you can do
She's
the next
terrific.
one. Sure.
Yeah. So the Frost, I think you're safe from Frost. I don't think he's likely to kill you at this point, unless he has abilities I'm not aware of. No, but I feel like we're kind of walking the edge here between the old all of the valuation questions. Liking something versus thinking something is good. I mean, there are plenty of poets that I don't like at all, but I admit that they're great poets. I mean, I don't spend a whole lot of time with plenty of poets who, if you asked me, is this a really significant poet who's written really significant poems, I would say, well, of course. It's just I don't really like it that much. I mean, to me, liking is a more ephemeral feeling, and it actually changes over time too. And then, of course, there are quite a lot of poets I like, but I don't necessarily think they're that great. I mean, I like to think I don't like any poets who aren't any good at all. But, one can be charmed by and enjoy a poet who's maybe not the greatest poet, but who's written some nice things and done some good work. So it's a complicated question. I want to come back to something Anahid said, which I think was really interesting, which is I've noticed over the years, most of us have some kind of underlying metaphor for our criticism. And I really like the way that you put that forward. It's like I'm a mechanic, you know, it's a really interesting model for a critic and a cool one. I mean, you see different writers talk about this in different ways, and of course, Stephanie knows a lot more about this than I do. But Randall Jarrell always had a kind of diagnostic feeling to his writing, or at least so he said. Now, whether what he says is the same as what he does, I would defer to Stephanie on that question. But it's always interesting to see what someone views as their role. I'm never really quite sure what my own role is. Sure, other people don't know either. But I like the idea of being a mechanic.
Should I answer that question about whether I can like something without knowing how it works? I think
Absolutely.
so, Stephanie, here's the thing. You're a poet, which I am not, right? So I wonder how much of that desire to know how something works and that related to the feeling of liking it is sort of built into the fact that you're also a practitioner, right? So I am very powerfully identified with the position of the critic. And I say in my book about Keats that I really am not comfortable even being described as a writer. And I'm only starting in my old age to become more comfortable, calling myself a writer. But I did want to pick up on what you said about the mid. I'm actually about to teach a seminar or a workshop rather on the mid because I think that we don't have a particularly good vocabulary for talking about things that are sort of okay. And this is particularly true, I mean, people say this all the time about contemporary criticism is that everything is either a pan or a press release. And obviously, this is not true of anyone, in this Zoom who writes criticism, but we all know that phenomenon, right? Where everything is either the most incredible thing that's ever been known to mankind or it's absolute dreck, its politics are atrocious, right? The writer should be hung up by their toes, all this. So, how do we talk about things that are mixed? Right? Are mediocre, are disappointing, are adequate? I think that those are really important and interesting questions, and in some ways, almost more kind of fun to grapple with, again, from a mechanics perspective, than things that are truly, truly excellent. I also find that I struggle sometimes both as a writer and as a teacher, to give a persuasive account of things that I absolutely adore because they're too close to me, right? So I have trouble, I think, teaching Keats, for example. I have trouble teaching Frank O'Hara. I have trouble teaching anything that I feel very, very passionately about because it's part of my DNA. And so I can't have the kind of, again, mechanics detachment from it that might be necessary. But yeah, this is a plea for the, not necessarily for the mid, but for a vocabulary of the mid, because I think we need it.
Well, I wish there was space for all of this, but I fear that there may not be. I'd love to read an essay by David on a poet that he feels is great, but he doesn't actually like. I think you would learn an immense amount about poetry from hearing that, because we all have that. We all have these hidden mixed feelings for things that we know are great, or mixed feelings about things that we don't feel are great, but we still like. Completely different form of sensibility, I think. Gets back, I think, to the question of fairness, which poetry critics think about, I think, especially ones who write for the New York Times Book Review and the New Yorker and the New York Review of Books. Um, uh, I know that Stephanie had this wonderful quotation about, let me find it here, where she said that there's so little airtime available for any poetry these days that when I get space and time in which I can do whatever I want, I don't want to say X sucks. And that is a kind of commercial pressure almost at this point in our culture. There are so few venues. I don't know if you can talk about those kinds of pressures and that sense of fairness. I know Stephanie, I was reading through Super Gay Poems. That required an immense
Me
amount of
too.
work to find all of those various poets from all these different eras and from our current era. Just a wide range of delighted reading, obviously. I think we all do this. We all receive hundreds of poetry books, and we're trying to be fair, but we're also trying to be honest with ourselves. I don't know, any thoughts?
Can we speak about goodness and greatness?
Sure, let's do
Eliot,
it.
T.S. Eliot of all people, and this is in his, I think it's in his introduction to Marianne Moore's 1935 selected poems, which is it's like the least reliable period of Eliot's career. He's in a bad place, but he is has his wits about him enough to understand that Marianne Moore is wonderful and wants more people to read her, as I do. And he says that it is pretty much impossible to pronounce with tact and authority and accuracy about which poets of your own time and your own generation are great. Don't even try. All you can say is what's good, what seems well made and worth sustained attention. And I kind of like that. Uh, I I think it is worth using the category great to talk about the poets of the past. There are ways in which I would distinguish someone like Whitman, or perhaps, alas, Frost, or Dickinson, or I don't know, Milton, from other poets I like who just don't have the same kind of scope and depth. Catherine Phillips, who's just so much fun and so good, or Swinburne. So I'm not saying don't ever call anything great, but I think the question of what's great is really a distraction from what what calls me back to it, what speaks to me, what holds my interest when I ask how it's put together, and why does it hold my interest? One of the questions I ask myself when I like something is, well, why do I like it? Do I like it because it's a kind of okay description of something that I am fascinated by? Or do I like it because it is a fascinatingly assembled description of something I otherwise wouldn't care about? I trust myself much more when I recommend, for example, the last few books by Bruce Smith, who writes about being a cis straight white dude from upstate New York who has a history with American football and blue collar pursuits and tends to write in fairly small, unrhymed units. Because I didn't do any of those things, except, you know, being white and being assigned male at birth. But Bruce Smith writes, and I'm recommending his more recent, like the last 15 years of books, not the first few. He writes about things I really would never think about unless I was really grabbed by the style and the shape of the language he's using. And so I really trust myself when I read what he's doing and say, oh, I trust myself somewhat less if I am reading a poem about the Raincoats, the band, or a poem about the X-Men, because those are things I think about all the time anyway. So maybe a part of me that responds to things other than style and shape and language and sound is drawn in.
Is this the part where we ask you about the X-Men?
If you dare.
Just watched the first X-Men movie with my kid, the one from the Bryan Singer one from way back. So X-Men is fresh on my mind, but I'm afraid even to ask your opinion of the X-Men movies.
We'll send you some comic books. The only really good one is Logan, although the New Mutants movie was okay.
This is good to know because I found rewatching that movie that I did not like it very much. I was
Because
like,
it's not very good. We'll send you some comics.
that I think that's the problem. So the good great distinction is I largely agree with what Stephanie's saying. I think another let's be honest here, another issue is that nobody likes to be wrong. And if you're going to throw out the great judgment as a critic, boy, did you just invite it. I mean, every time I think about this, I'm reminded of the fact that at one point, there was the critic for the Atlantic's Peter Davidson decided to do this and wrote a piece. This was many, it was decades and decades ago. Wrote a piece saying, well, who are the really great poets today? And one of his answers was James Dickey. And look, I'm from South Carolina. If there's any poet, American poet, whose own background resembles mine more than James Dickey's, I'd love to know who that person is. Maybe Terrence Hayes, actually, we went to the same high school. But James Dickey. And every time I think about that, this is why Elizabeth Bishop is alive. I just think it's amazing. He's completely wrong. I mean, I've just put my cards on the table here. I do not think James Dickey is a great poet at all, or even really close to being a great poet, although he has moments where he's sort of okay. But I do think that that's a fear. Every time I think about this, am I going to call this poet great or whatever? I always think about that review and how you can just be wrong as a critic sometimes. And we're all a little afraid of it. You don't like to admit it to yourself, but you really, I mean, not you, but maybe I'll just speak for myself. I am certainly afraid of it sometimes. But this gets tangled up in questions about audience, which is a really important issue that Stephanie raised, I think, in response to the first question. A lot of times, if you're writing for some of these larger venues, I mean, no one's paying any attention to these pieces. So, I mean, they're not paying attention to the fiction pieces. So you can imagine how little attention they're paying to the poetry pieces. You got to do stuff, or people don't read them. This is just a fact. And so you have to work with yourself to decide what you think will be a reasonable and appropriate thing that will hold up over time, both for the art of poetry and for the individual poet, and also for you, however you construe yourself, whether it's as a critic, as Anahid was saying, or a writer, or a poet writer, or whatever variant you may be. It's always lurking in the background, because in the end, however much we try to put scotch tape over it or duct tape, what we engage in is an evaluative enterprise. You can engage in it in a kind of mechanic fashion, but there's still underlying that is going to be this question of, is this thing worth reading or is it not worth reading? At least that's how a lot of readers are going to approach it.
Can I ask a question about that? If you're
Absolutely.
Everyone, if you're reviewing the work of a living poet as opposed to a collected or whatever, right? If you're reviewing a work of a living poet, are you hoping that that poet reads the review and learns something from it? Particularly if it's negative, right? Are you thinking, because I often wish my utopia, right? My critic's utopia is one in which there were a slightly more, I don't want to say symbiotic, but a slightly more dialogic relationship between the critic and the writer, and there's been times where I've wanted to say something more forceful about a book that I did not like, because I wanted the author, I mean, in my arrogance, because I wanted the author to learn something, right? I mean, I want things to be good. No one wants things to be bad, right? So, but when you're writing and you're thinking, I hope this person reads this and takes something away from it, learns something, is challenged by it.
Stephanie, you want to tackle that? That's a great question.
Anahid, I think that there is an idea of argument, or of challenging someone's premises, or of changing someone's ideas at a higher level of abstraction than the individual work of art, that is fundamental to what you're doing. I think that's really cool. I think it collides with the idea of the mid, which honestly often means a perfectly interesting example of something that is stylistically, it's fine, but we know what it is. I listen to a fair amount of kind of mid rock music. But I don't think I listen to a lot of mid 19th century composed music. I think of César Franck as exceptional. And at some point, this is going to turn into a discussion of pop punk, which is such a good example of something that will always be. Yeah, I mean, like if I don't know if you went through a pop punk phase, but we need to talk about the music of Andrew McMahon, who is great, but also mid. But let's bring this back around to, do you want the author to read you? Like, it depends on the author. Like, that's not up to me. The only reviews that I write where I really want the author to read me are when I'm reviewing someone I think is great and neglected and kind of mid-career or late career. I have been screaming at anyone who will listen about how Alan Peterson is one of the great poets of our time for decades.
For many years, you've been doing this.
Well, because I'm right. He is the A.R. Ammons of our time. He's so smart. He is demographically uninteresting, in the way, for example, that I am demographically interesting to some people. He's never lived in a major urban center. He does not write criticism or reviewing or scholarship. He doesn't teach in an MFA program. He was the chair of the painting department at a community college in Florida for most of his life, and published with fairly small presses because he never had the chance to go to parties and network. And now he's, I think, 80 and retired and in Oregon, and there's like 10 books, and there's going to be an 11th this year. And he's so good, and I want everyone to read Alan Peterson. I don't really care if they read my reviews, if they read him, but I do care if he reads my reviews, because he needs to know that there are people paying close attention to this work that reflects this tremendously agile mind. and this tremendously kind and observant and science friendly and loving imagination. So yeah, I want him to read when I write about him. But the last time I wrote about Anne Carson, I was explaining why Knox is a bad book, which I continue to think. And I didn't really care if she was going to read it. And when I write about Terrence Hayes, which I do every chance I get, because if anybody our age has a chance to, like, is seems great in America, he's got a good acclaim as any. But I love writing about Terrence Hayes. He kind of already knows that he's got a lot of readers. And I'm, you know, okay, great, whatever. He's busy. He's got a full calendar. But yeah, I don't think I'm going to convince anyone that they were wrong about their own work. But when I'm dealing with wonderful, neglected living authors, I would like them to know that someone's reading them. And sometimes, one person makes a difference. The reason, I don't know if anyone else here likes the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam in the Fitzgerald translation. Um, but if I'm not mistaken, somebody, I think DJ Rossetti, just finds that in like a remainder pile somewhere. And it's like, who is this guy, Edward Fitzgerald? This is great. So, one reader can really do a lot for a relatively neglected living author. And for that, you do want the author to notice.
It's
But
such a good question, isn't it? It's an interesting question. So first of all, I absolutely agree with Stephanie that the one clear instance where you actually do want the writer to hear you and it's when the writer needs some encouragement, you know? I mean, and that's just a decent human impulse. I don't have any problem with that at all, and have tried to do it myself on a couple of occasions. I think that if you're writing a negative review, which you have, some people do them, some people don't. I've done them, and I've never ever written one and thought to myself, "Boy, I hope this son of a bitch reads this review." Never, not once. No, never. Because the thing is that I mean, I could see a person who felt that way, but I'm not that person. I don't actually enjoy writing them, contrary to what people appear to think sometimes. And I certainly am not thinking to myself, I've shown this motherfucker. Like, you're writing it because you got to entertain people because it's not a good book, or the writer's overrated, or the writer's gotten really lazy, which is another thing that certainly happens a lot. And I guess maybe that's the only thing I would want to sometimes convey to a writer is you're getting kind of lazy here. Like, what's up with that? There have been a couple of instances where I've written what I would describe as not a negative review, but a kind of mixed review where I'm appreciative of the person's talents, but I think they're going in a bad direction or they've gotten sloppy. I get really cranky about sloppiness, which is ridiculous because I'm an incredibly sloppy person myself. But what's life without hypocrisy? So I don't know. If you write a really positive review, it would feel rather oily to be thinking, "Oh, I hope this person reads this so that we can email each other and be best friends." I don't know, Annie. What do you think? Do you want do you want to engage with everybody or just some people, and then why?
I mean, I never write with that intention,
Right.
or even necessarily with that fantasy. I mean, I don't know, I just this week had an essay, it's not a review, but it was an essay about this Lebanese photographer, Miriam Boulos, came out, and she did write to me and say, I'm crying at every word, I feel so seen. And I felt very gratified by that because I love her work, right? And so I think that language, I mean, it's kind of that the phrase "I feel so seen" has become so overused, but it's actually a really powerful thing for somebody to say to a critic or to a reader, And so
Right.
I love that, the sense that somebody thinks that I really have understood something that they haven't felt was understood in their work before. I think again, the sort of fantasy that I do have is when I'm reviewing, say, a first book, and I think there's talent, but there's maybe there was a rush to publish, or, the book isn't really that well thought out, or somebody could have sat with their life as well as their poetry for another couple of years. Then I kind of do think I hope that somebody reads this and takes to heart some of what is said, because something can be done with it, right? If you're
Right.
reviewing somebody who's 70, like they're not going to change anything about their practice based on what you've said. But maybe if you're reviewing the work of somebody who's 30 or 32 and you're saying, this is very strong, this is perhaps a slightly weaker element of their practice, maybe that can be helpful.
I think I wish we had more time because so many things are coming out of this conversation, and you have wandered into some of the questions that we wanted to ask. And if there was more, the things that I think, you know, deserve some attention is I hear talking about that's unique to poetry criticism, because this came up in the questions that are coming up in the chat, but is the idea of an individual poem versus a book of poem, right? Well, what can, individual poems can can sing, so to speak, in a mid book. And Steph, you have in your new book Super Gay Poems, and before that you have these opportunities to dig into individual poems, and of course David with the Frost poem. But so I, I I also, the other thing that I wish we had more time for that I'm going to use to segue into this is the idea of the weight of what criticism means. Steph, as you say, well, Terrence Hayes, he's got the attention, or that first book who hasn't been addressed. But one of the things that's coming up in the Q&A that also came up in what you said, Anahid, and I get a lot of emails like this as well, is poets who don't expect that they will ever be reviewed, right? For other reasons. So from Jawad Ali says, if the sound of a poem and making assumptions about how much the audience knows about the content the poem was written in are two important criteria, then I guess we shouldn't be surprised that most readers of contemporary poetry don't really know the work of poets from other traditions. And most importantly, aren't these criteria hugely problematic for the reception of work from other traditions? So I thought maybe that would be a worthwhile one to touch on in terms of, what do you need to know as a critic, or circling back to what does your audience need to know, and how much can you fit into a review when you're trying to give other contexts that are complex, and who gets left out of those conversations. So any of those threads that you'd like to pick up on in response to that question in the Q&A.
Everybody thinking about it.
No, I'm so that's a lot of threads. That's a rich tapestry.
It's a lot of threads.
So poems describe and present and work to make available some kind of experience, more or less specific, more or less literal, more or less abstracted. And they do so in language, in at least one language. I have noticed, to my frustration and sorrow, how much easier it is to get Americans interested in poems that depict experience they already find interesting, either because it's familiar or because it's in the news at the time, than to get Americans interested in poems that depict experiences they're just like, what even is that? I have noticed that it's easier to write about and get publicity for poets who are already famous and poets who are already known to the people in the institutions of publishing. One of the reasons the NBCC exists is to try to counter that. I like to think that I make a reasonable effort to write about and advocate, if I like them enough, and really direct attention to and pay attention to poets who come from experiences that are not my own and far from, Harvard and I-95 and Boston and New York City and American whiteness, for example. And it's very frustrating to try to do that because, I mean, I've been trying to get somebody in America to do an anthology of poetry from New Zealand because there's so much good stuff going on there for God knows how long. And everyone says, well, it won't sell. No one wants to do it. That said, I am speaking about poems written in English or partly in English. I have very different feelings about poems where the experience of the language is the experience of another language.
Mhm.
I write about poems in Spanish with facing page translations and poems in mixed Spanish and English and poems in ancient Greek because those are languages I can sort of read. Quite a lot of work is in Persian and Arabic and French and 10 different kinds of Chinese and Thai and Welsh and who knows what else. And I really don't feel comfortable writing about poems written in languages I don't read.
Mm.
Um, unless someone asks me to write about a translation and treat the translation as an original, which, everyone in the Renaissance had the chance to do. But that is a limit. Just what language is the poem made of?
Mhm.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't really disagree with any of that. I think that's all correct. And in fact, what I was going to say in response to the question, as I understood it, is just look, I'm a poetry critic who writes about poems written in English. If the poem is in another language, first of all, I'm not really equipped to say anything about it that would be really interesting to people. And I can only imagine the scorn with which any of my pronouncements would be greeted by people who are native speakers of that language, you know? I mean, I've had to write about translations before, mostly because I was assigned to do so, and I've done my best, but it's always tricky, and you always know you're not quite up to snuff on that particular poet. So, I mean, I also think you have to distinguish between issues of, none of us gets to decide who gets to be a poet at all, and that's a key thing to remember at all times. You don't get to decide. I don't get to decide. Nobody gets to decide. Anyone could turn out to be great, and there might be someone you don't even really like. In fact, it probably will be, and it may be somebody who doesn't check the boxes that you want checked. And I think that is always important to remember. But at the same time, you have to remember poetry is actually an art form. It does have a history, it does have context, and we operate within those things. And we don't operate above and outside of them. We too are part of this thing. And so, you don't want to get into the trap of thinking that, well, just because, you happen to like these poets who write in the language that you actually speak, that there's something wrong with that. There's not. It's okay.
I do want to clarify, in case I don't know if you all are looking exactly at the Q&A that
I can't see it on this iPad. I'm sorry.
Right, they say, if making assumptions about how much the audience knows about the context the poem was written in. So they're not necessarily talking about in other languages, right?
Oh,
but
I see.
Intersections that, audiences might not be familiar with the context of those poems, even if written in English, right? With the multiplicity.
Oh, I see. Okay, right. No, that's a totally different issue, and I probably would agree with the person who posted the question. That I mean, that's part of your job as a critic is to make that context evident to people so that they can appreciate it, and to go looking for things that are a little bit outside of the context that you yourself know. I see people nodding. Did I say something bad?
No. Anahid, did you have something to add to that?
No, I just discovered that we can see the Q&A. So I was
Right. I'm still trying to do it.
You want to tackle one of the Q&As before we close down for the evening? Or I don't know what you can see there. Well, we're at four.
I'm going to take a look at the Q&A in case there's something that really.
Yeah,
Okay,
I
good.
can't see it. So if somebody can see it, like, if we have something
You
really
should be
interesting,
actually
I'd love
see
to
it.
talk about it.
If
David,
you move your cursor to the bottom of the screen where you see like participants chat, raise hand, you should be able to see Q&A.
between share and hide captions.
Okay, great. Yeah, no. I
Ooh.
haven't used this mechanism. I'm using my laptop typically. I'm on an iPad. Haven't done it before, and this is okay. Great. Yeah. Sorry to be an idiot. Thank you, Anna.
Can I just lightning round all of the ones I've got answers to?
Absolutely.
Um, it sucks that most readers of contemporary poetry don't know the works of poets from other traditions, and these criteria are hugely problematic. I'd be happy if people were just able to know other and older English speaking traditions, work in English from Nigeria. That's tough enough. Um, uh, What's Critics who review poetry need to be able to talk about how the poems sound and about the shape small bits of language have. That's optional if you review novels or nonfiction. It's required for poetry. Chris Claremont formed me, as Philip Larkin said of Cyril Connolly. I am very much a Chris Claremont fan, and I even like the later Claremont like mechanics that most people don't like. Um, we should all try to address our own biases, but the reason, since we can't, it's important for editors to have emotionally and geographically and demographically diverse sets of reviewers. I have absolutely been wrong about a book. I have no idea. Mira Rosenthal, who's a very, very good translator who works, I think, from Polish and some other languages, asks how to convince an editor that a book is important. I don't know. If I could do that, Alan Peterson would win major prizes. Um, uh, we all think about content all the time because content and form are inseparable. Mixed or negative reviews are only worth writing if the poet is an example of something bad that's happening, or if the poet is extremely famous and therefore leads young people astray. Mira Bang is wonderful, and you should all read what she's doing. And is correct that doing interviews with new poets is a good way, or older poets is a good way to get poets noticed when they're not being reviewed. Someone on this chat should interview Mary Jo Bang, who has just done the Paradiso, which is part of her Mammoth Dante project. And poets get their works to me either by sending me a PDF or by US mail to my university address.
Oh my gosh, are we all going to try to speed run through this?
You do, yes.
I would
Yes.
co-sign all those speed answers.
They all sounded good. They sounded really good. Do you want me to run through it too? I can try to do it. I know we're kind of out of time here, but I don't want to ignore people's questions.
You're doing a low percentage speed run?
Low percentage speed run.
So
I think I actually addressed the first question a bit, and I find that I don't particularly disagree with the point that Jawad Ali is making here. It seems largely reasonable to me. Maybe we're a little sideways to each other there more than anything else. I don't actually think this point is really that disputable. Let's see. I cannot address anything about Chris Claremont and Stephanie. I don't even addressed. How do you address your own biases that poets who are not included in the canon are given a chance to be reviewed? That's actually related to the point being made by Jawad Ali earlier. You do your best. I mean, we're all creatures of biases. I mean, you have to get outside your comfort zone a little bit, which actually brings us interestingly back to this idea early on of writing about a poet that you think is great, but you don't actually like. If there's ever a clear instance of just one's personal, I mean, it's not even a bias, it's just your personality. I actually love that idea, by the way. And now I feel like I should probably try to do that. Like, a long time ago, Chris Wyman, when he edited Poetry Magazine, did this series called Antagonisms, which consisted of having people write about poets who were generally acknowledged to be good, or poems that were generally acknowledged to be major poems that they just don't like. And I actually found it really refreshing because it brought a lot of honesty out of people. And you could also see where people were coming from. So that's kind of a fun thing. Have you ever been wrong about a book? Almost certainly. The answer is Surely I have. Do I think I've been wrong? Not exactly. I will say I have been excessive about books before, which is not quite the same as being wrong. And I'll give you an example that makes me look like a jerk too. When I was a young, fiery, snotty critic, a phase that I know Stephanie remembers well, I reviewed a poet who I'm not going to say the name, and I was a little scathing about her book. Not exactly scathing, but I basically called her mid. I feel like my 13-year-old daughter is going to come down here and yell at me for using her slang. But, I was like 25 or something, and I just really mouthed off about it. And I never heard a word from her. But last year, she sent me a letter, all these many, like 25 years later. And it was so gracious and nice about, and just saying, she's really old and she wanted to just write to me because at least I read her book and took it seriously. And I'm much older and I have a different view of life now. And I thought it was the most amazing thing anyone had ever done. So I wrote back to her really warmly and said, look, it's a lot younger. And she said, I actually found your review useful in some way. And she was so charitable to me that it was incredibly humbling. And I try to remember that because, we all got to be humble in our own way. So maybe I was wrong there. I don't know. How much of these critics tackle the content of poetry? I try to. Anahid, you have a direct question here.
I know. I'm saving it for my turn with the lightning round.
Absolutely. So I want to focus on.
You can answer the one to me, though.
This is a really good question. What role, if any, do mixed or negative reviews play in today's poetry world? Well, there aren't that many of them, is the answer. There never have been. And the reason is that poetry is very small, and the downside to writing negative reviews is steep. And people don't realize it when they write them, but it's there. And the only way to keep yourself afloat as a critic, if you go that route, is to be lucky, be good, and even then, I don't know. Poetry is part art form and part community at this point, and the community aspects have a lot of worthy things about them, but they can also be fairly stifling. And communities don't like to be corrected. They really don't. No community likes to be corrected. And that's what you do sometimes as a critic, is you say, hey, this thing we're all doing, it's a bad idea. And nobody wants to hear it. I mean, there's no group of human beings that wants to hear that. So I think that mixed and negative reviews are pretty valuable, actually. But I know that not everybody feels that way. I mean, I also hear Stephanie's point, which is that you only get to say so much. Why would you spend your time saying this negative thing? And, we have a many year-long slight disagreement about this. But I do absolutely understand the point. I don't know. I hope that's helpful.
If we're all doing something, if we're all participating in some folly, we absolutely need to have negative reviews that say, stop doing this. But if some one poet you've never heard of is doing it, that's not worth your time to explain why they should stop.
Yeah, I saw Major's question. Major Jack's with an awesome question. Declaring, is there a corresponding fear of declaring someone meh? There seems to be widespread agreement that a poet is the voice of their generation. Adding in the LOL. Yeah, man, I second the LOL. I mean, there's a fear of it. There's also a huge opportunity. And actually, if you're a young critic and you're thinking about, making a name for yourself, this is the classic way to do it. You find the people who are overinflated and who weren't that great, and when somebody's saying that James Dickey is the greatest poet living at the time, you say, actually, he absolutely is not. Do you read The Heaven of Animals? Come on, man. So anyway, that's my speed run. And Anahid, I hope I've left you some time. Sorry about that.
No. I think maybe what I'll do is I'll just address the one question which was directed right to me. But the other thing briefly, though, I will say is apropos, how do you kind of militate against your own biases? Obviously, we can only all of us do that to a certain extent. But I will say just on a practical level is if I am reviewing something and I think that I don't quite know enough of the historical or cultural context about it. So like, for one example, I was reviewing a translation of poetry by Joyce Mansour, and I didn't know, that much about what it's like to live in Egypt in the 1960s and 1970s, but I have friends who are Egyptian. So I emailed them and I said, will you run me through this, right? What's the thing that I don't know and that I'm not going to find by Googling? What's the kind of poetic context? What's the tradition? So I think that, again, this is just a very practical answer to a question that has more than practical resonances, but, ask people who know more than you for help. There's no rule that says a review has to come entirely from your own forehead, right? You can use other people as resources. So that's something that I do. But the question to me was to talk, what's my process in writing about something? I mean, this seems like it should go without saying, but first I read the book all the way through. I'm always astonished by the number of reviews I read, and it shows particularly when people are writing about novels, but not only about novels, where it's clear that the critic simply has not read the entire book. So, I read the entire book. I read with a pen in my hand. I need to be very, very, very tactile. I refuse to read PDFs. Sorry to all the publicists who email me saying, here's the PDF. I don't care. Send me the hard copy. Like I can't do it. If I can't write on the screen and know the iPad I've never been able to make that work. If I can't write on the page, it's not going to work for me. So I read pen in hand. I, will mark up something that I want to come back to. I'll take notes, usually in the sort of, like the front of the book, things to revisit, things to look up. And then I usually, I start sort of where the spirit moves me and inevitably have to revise the first 3 paragraphs of whatever I've written. I have to revise the rest of it too, but usually the first 3 paragraphs are just the kind of like starting the engine and figuring out where you're going to put your feet, and then the thing begins to take shape. I'm a very, very aggressive self-editor, so I go through things that I've, drafts many, many times and tweak sentences and tweak punctuation. And then again, I don't always show something to someone other than my editor, but sometimes if I'm worried that I've been too harsh or I'm worried that I'm not taking account of all the things that need to be taken account of, I will show something to a trusted friend like Maureen McLean or, like anybody else. Yeah, so that's kind of my process, and I'm very, very lucky. All the venues that I typically write for have amazing, amazing editors that I have wonderful relationships with. So I trust my editors a lot, and I also love being edited. I'm a very, very good disciplinary subject. Like I will take all edits. I very rarely fight on anything. So yeah, that's a very sort of surface level answer to that question, but that's the gist of it.
Well, that's lovely. And I think we'll end there for now. Morgan, do you have anything to add? I wanted to say thank you so much to Anahid, Stephanie, and David for just an absolutely delightful conversation. I could do this every week forever and still learn so much from all of you. It's been absolutely a delight on behalf of the National Book Critics Circle. I think you've helped our cause with poetry with the circle just by being here. So, Morgan?
Are we supposed to say, please consider joining if you're not already a member at bookcritics.org?
That's exactly what I was going to say. And you can be part of ongoing conversations. We have here members, Balakian Prize winner, David Orr. If you are a member, you can submit your criticism for that award. There's a lot of conversation on Slack, on events like this. And, this is what it's about, people bringing their, we do, as Steph said earlier, why would you do this if you didn't love it, right? And this love for thinking about books. I also want to say I think we have a possibility for a new NBCC event, which is the speed Q&A. So I'll come back again with that platform. But thank you for your generosity, all of you, and to everyone who came out to join us.
Bye, everyone.